I'm Yoni Skolnick. I'm a principal game designer at Wizards of the Coast, working on Magic the Gathering. I've been working on Magic for over 10 years now, and I was the game design, set design lead for Aetherdrift. Mark Rosewater led the initial vision design portion of the set, and then I took over for the long run, working with a wide variety of teams to make sure everything on the set was where it needed to be a quality product.
So Yanni, when there's a new set coming out,
Mhm.
and Mike approves it and does all the stuff he needs to do, where do you step in? Like, what is your first thing that you do when a set comes out as a designer?
Yeah, so I was on the vision design team that Mark Rosewater was leading. So he initially led like 1 to 2 month exploratory design period where they got together a wide variety of ideas and then brought together the vision team to review those ideas and start coming up with a plan for what do we think the key aspects of the set are, what do we think the most important things to hit are, and what are some of the mechanics we want to explore when doing that. So Mark led that team for about 4 months, where we came up with a bunch of mechanics, play tested them, figured out most of the skeleton of the set, knowing that it would have 10 racing teams that would get a lot of creative attention, knowing it would be on the three worlds of Avishkar, Ket, and Muruganda. There were a few of the details that changed after he handed off to me with set design. At that point, I had, a file of cards that we had been playtesting thus far, but it wasn't really a full cohesive set or, had the total amount of rares. So my first job at that point was kind of testing out the mechanics and validating these are things we can work on. I first like to start with constructed, thinking about how will they play out in standard, how will they play out in other formats, can we make cards that are appealing to Commander, since the Vision team focused a lot more on limited. So after a month of focusing on just do these mechanics make sense, do we know how to execute on them, move to more focusing on the set as a whole and getting it to be an entire file, meaning it has the right number of commons and uncommons and rares, and that it has all the elements you'd expect of a Magic set.
It's funny. You almost sound like it's a team collaborative effort. I think most people think it's a one single person designing every card and making their life either great or hell.
Yep. No, it's a very collaborative effort. I definitely, as the set design lead, do have a large role, and every card is going through me, and I'm putting kind of my stamp on approval of it. But also, every card I'm working with many other people on, even from just a game design aspect. Sometimes there will be a card that I think of myself and throw into the set file, but we're going to get that into several draft play tests. If we think it's going to show up in Commander, then the casual play design team will play it. If we think it's going to show up in more competitive formats, then the other play design team will play it. And even if it's not seeing a lot of play testing, we have several review sessions where various groups of people come together and look through all the cards of the set and give feedback. And that's just game design, not even getting into all the editing and templating and all the creative aspects of the card.
Is it challenging? Because you mentioned before that, you look at a set and you're like, okay, it has to be standard, has to be, commander, has to be draft. Because I feel like you have to hit all those goals a little bit. Like some cards will be for draft, some cards will be for standard, some cards will be in commander. And I feel like there's certain players that are just like, well, I only play commander. There's nothing in this set for me except one card. Because you have more than just, it's a very famous format, the most popular format, but like you also got to think of other ways to use the set. Is it challenging when trying to hit all those goalposts?
Yes, very challenging. In fact, I would say probably that's the hardest part of the job, is making sure that the set has something for everyone, that enough cards are exciting in the most popular formats, that enough cards work in especially draft, standard, and commander, but also that they're appealing in other formats like modern, and also that they just look appealing to a casual player. Oftentimes, Commander is our proxy for casual player, of like a player who just plays at their kitchen table with their friends and doesn't go to a store or any larger environment. But Commander isn't all of them. So we try to think through a lot of different lenses, looking through the set and thinking of, are there ways we can add appeal to a certain card for a certain demographic that might be underserved.
Does that mean you have to be careful when you're doing things like legendary commanders in a set, just because you have to, because you can play those in any format, but people want to use those in commander? Do you have to like double check those or triple, just make sure they're designed balanced wise, I guess, for the commander pool?
Yeah, definitely any legendary creature is going to get extra scrutiny from the commander team. And sometimes we struggle of like, here's a design that for standard, we'd rather you put four of this card in your deck, and it's not ideal as a legendary creature. But the commander team says, oh, this would actually be a really cool commander. Can it be a legendary creature? And so sometimes we're thinking of individual designs, which team to prioritize, and that's based on, how the set is already meeting the needs of one of those formats or groups. And are there ways we could move designs around to have our cake and eat it too, and get everything where it'll have the maximum appeal.
You also have this cool racing mechanic in this new set. Mm-hmm. What's it like when you interject something new that affects all formats, essentially?
Yeah. So the start your engines mechanic, it was a challenging mechanic to work with, and it was one that kind of needed to be optimized format by format. So for limited and draft and sealed, that was a lot about making sure that individual cards worked well enough if you only had one or two cards with start your engines, but also that if you drafted all of them together, it made for a cohesive deck. Very important cards for those are a cycle of common creatures that have an ability that at max speed you can exile them from your graveyard to draw a card, and that's there to ensure that if you start tracking your engine, if you start your engines, start caring about your speed, you're going to continue to care about it. And that's why there's that graveyard ability to make sure that even if your permanent with the ability went away, you're going to be able to do that. For standard, a lot of the focus was in how do we make a deck where you're putting a lot of start your engines cards in together and making that satisfying. For example, Burnout Bastronaut is a red 1-mana creature that's a very important piece for standard. It starts your engines early, it starts increasing your speed, and it gets a big reward when you get to max speed. And then for Commander, it was especially challenging mechanic because in Standard and Draft, it's usually about getting a card with the mechanic out early so you can max your speed and improve all your cards. For Commander, that mostly needs to be on your legendary commander, or else it's not very reliable. Since we're only printing so many cards with the set, you're not really going to be able to make a commander deck full of them. So my favorite legendary creatures we made for commanders are ones that are cheap and have an extremely impactful ability such that it's worth your while to invest in getting your speed up. Vin Wixit, or Vin for short, is a 2-mana 0/4 creature that's mono blue, and normally your mono blue commander deck isn't going to be caring about dealing your opponent's damage early. So because it's a little bit of an unnatural fit, it means we can really give you a strong reward. So it says whenever you draw a card, you draw twice that many cards, which for a 2-mana card is unheard of, but you really have to focus on getting early aggro, which your blue deck normally wouldn't do.
I feel like I've played Magic my whole life, but on and off, so you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but a lot of the times when there's a new set, there's usually a new mechanic. It's usually kind of like a slight offshoot of something that's been done before, like, a slight different version of like time counters, for example, or whatever, right? Yep. But this mechanic seemed relatively new to me. Like I've never heard of something like this in the set before, and it seemed just a cool idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we really wanted something novel and immersive to give the feeling of a race, since, we've played with vehicles before, and we knew that most of the elements would be something familiar. So we wanted this to really make people like they're doing something different, especially in limited games. We always, because there's 30 some odd years of Magic cards, we're always comparing it to other things, like you said. And this has elements of Ascend, elements of battles, because you have to hit attack with creatures early to make it work. But at the end, it doesn't really map closely to any of those. So it was certainly more challenging to work on and needed a closer eye, given it has such unique play patterns.
Can you give us an example of a card that comes across your desk that you have to change or rework or do something with it so that it fits in the set better or is more balanced or just plays better?
I mean, most cards need some amount of iteration and working on them. I guess the Mendicant Core is another Start Your Engines card that I love, that I really wanted to try and get right. It's an artifact legendary creature, and once you've reached max speed, whenever you cast an artifact spell, you can copy that spell and get more and just get another copy of it, which is a very powerful effect, especially on a 2-mana card. It started with its power and toughness, both increasing with a number of artifacts you control, but that was a lot of power because you're building your commander deck to have tons of artifacts, and it's giving you even more. And I really wanted to preserve that it was a 2-mana creature, because in Commander it might be your only card with Start Your Engine, so you really need to get it out early. But basically in every format we play tested in, it felt clearly too strong. And it was like, oh, it should probably be 3 mana. But it was one I was really trying to preserve at 2 mana. So it ended up, its toughness became always 3 toughness instead of scaling. So that it's a lot easier for your opponents to answer even when you have a more powerful board. And we added the cost that you have to pay an additional mana to copy spells. So that's one where it would have been a lot simpler to just say, okay, it's a 3 mana card and it doesn't have, these downsides on it. But with the nature of how it plays out in Commander, I felt it was really important to start at 2 mana, even if some of the other elements of a card are less explosive.
And that's just how some cards are, right? Like some cards are meant to be played with Commander in mind. Some cards are meant to be played with Standard. Like sometimes they all have their place, and I think that's such a thing people don't realize when a new set comes out, because they're just like, I only play this set, and they don't have enough cards for this set. It's like we have a few, but not all of them.
And many cards we're hopeful will show up in multiple contexts, like this Mendicant Core. I am hopeful will also make an impact in Standard, and so we're side by side thinking about its play patterns in Commander and Standard and trying to see, is there a way we can get it to the right spot for both of them, which is very challenging. But a couple years ago, in addition to having a competitive play design, we started the casual play design team led by Melissa DeTora. And that's been extremely helpful for being able to really get into the nitty-gritty details on multiple formats and bring different types, people with different expertise together for those conversations.
Is there a specific card in the set you're like really excited to get in the hands of millions of players to see what they do with it in a specific format?
I mean, I'm very excited for the Aether Spark, especially in Commander. It's the headliner for the set, so we're releasing 500 of them in serialized versions. It's a very unique type line of legendary artifact equipment planeswalker, and I really thought about what it's hoping that its impact will be very cool in Commander. It's something where you're really putting a target on yourself by putting it down, putting it on your creature, and often immediately threatening that on your next turn you're going to get 10 mana right away. But also it's more protected from creature attacks than most planeswalkers are by virtue of it can't be attacked while it's on a creature. And, sometimes players might think, oh, I'll just answer whatever they'll spend the 10 mana on, so it's not an issue. So I'm especially interested to see how that one plays out.
The speed mechanic is really cool too as well. In my preview of that, if I can remember correctly, you can only gain 1 speed per turn. Talk about about that design process, why you guys settled on that instead of like having to go from 1 to 4 immediately in one turn, or spending 3 cards to go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 speed.
Yeah, the role of a speed mechanic is quite interesting. At one point, we were wondering, should we be leaning very much into this being an aggressive set since it's about a race? And oftentimes when we use the word race in Magic, we're talking about aggro decks attacking past each other. But also it's a multi-planner, multi-day race. So it's a lot about attrition in the actual story. And so I appreciated that this was something that moment to moment is about going fast and hitting your opponent. But over the course of a game, you have to do it over at least 3 turns of increasing your speed. And also we liked giving you rewards that were about giving you a stronger late game or helping you draw more cards, so that it wasn't always just about pushing the aggression and getting your opponent's life to 0 as quickly as possible. Yeah, so I appreciated that it was making early game aggression important and giving the feel of a race, but not being entirely about ending games quickly. Part of that is very often, a lot of players don't enjoy our draft environments that are entirely about aggro and ending games quickly. So while there are strategies that do that, the black-red strategy in draft is a lot about ending the game quickly with max speed cards. I appreciated that having it be over 3 turns would provide unique dynamics to the game and mean you make it so you're caring about attacks in different ways.
What's a big misconception about being a designer on the Magic team? Like when someone asks you, and you tell them you're a designer, and like, what's the big misconception they think? That you sit down by yourself at your desk and make all the cards? Is that?
Yeah, that's definitely a big one. Or that specifically just Mark Rosewater makes all the cards and all the decisions. There's a lot of times I see snarky people on Reddit commenting, oh, whoever made this card should get fired. And then their next comment is a card they like, and they're like, whoever designed this card should get a raise. And I was both of those people. And I'm like, but really also, I was both of those people, but I collaborated with 9 other people, and we all put our stamp of approval on it. So even in the cases where it does feel like one person designed a card, there's so many other people approving it and giving feedback on it that it really just is collaborative at every step.
Does your team just start with a block of text and like stats and like on like the digital version of pen and paper, I guess?
Mm-hmm.
Do you actually get to see art or implement that art at any time during the design phase, or is art the last thing that is put on your cards?
Yeah, so very often before we start, there will be like 10 art pieces that we made as concept art to show like, here's the visual proof of why a Death Race set looks cool and appealing. And then maybe about a third of the way through process, we have the concept push, which is when we get a bunch of outside artists to come to the building for 3 weeks, and we just make a ton of pieces of art and create a whole world guide of those pieces of art. And then we can start referencing the world guide and those concepts, but they're not final pieces of art. They're just rough concepts. But at that point, we feel like we really understand what the set's going to look like. And I can start being like, oh, instead of writing, fast car guy into the file, I'll write end rider spike wielder, because I saw there was an end rider character with a spike. And I'm like, I bet this would make sense as that character. And then at a later point, once we're pretty deep into the design of a set, is when we'll start commissioning individual pieces. So, various folks from the creative department will go in a meeting, and I'll join them, and we'll see that card that I wrote in as end rider spike wielder, and they'll sometimes say, okay, yeah, that makes sense. We saw you put this in from the world guide, so it'll be that. And other times they're like, actually, I was hoping to use the spike wielder art on this other card, so we're going to make this into a goblin creature, and it'll reference this other point in the world guide, or we'll brainstorm a whole bunch of other ideas for what the card could be. And then as we're finalizing the playtesting for the set is when most of the final art comes in. So we do have a chance with the final art to be like, oh, did the art that came in match our expectations? Does the card design make sense for it? Or do we need to make any last minute changes while we still have time to test those?
And then my last question for you is, we talked about the favorite card you wanted to see players get their hands on, but what's your favorite card this set that you just like?
So I'm a sucker for vanilla creatures. It's one of the silliest themes that a lot of game designers love, but is not really that actually satisfying in practice, which is why it's a very small element of a set. But we have these 5 legendary creatures with no abilities that are a reference to Muruganda. So like there's a 3-mana 7/2 in black and a 1 and a blue 0/8 in blue. And then there's a green creature that says when you play it, you can search out any creature with no abilities from your deck. So I really enjoy having just this small package of cards in draft where it's like, okay, I've got my red-green Exhaust Matters deck, but also I've got this, 4-mana creature that searches out my 5-mana 9/7 giant ooze monster. So in a set with a lot of intricate things going on, I'm very happy we were able to find room for these 5 very simple cards that still manage to add a lot to gameplay.
Awesome, Yanni. And when does the set come out?
Properly releases February 14th, Valentine's Day. Pre-releases, I believe, February 7th.
Awesome.